What's happening, fellas? This video is mostly going to be for Tony. Going to be pretty rudimentary, cut and dry, simplified, probably missing some steps, but just a quick rundown of how these motors work and what things you can do when you're trying to get one running and tune for performance and all that. Just the basics. And then yeah, I got an idea for some videos. I won't even say, but yeah, we'll be going over that in depth, kind of going over everything in depth. But like I was saying, I think in the last video, maybe make them a little bit more professional. Okay, so, oh, kind of fun. This is that 22-year-old Aeroworks. It's 118 or 120, I'm not sure. I gotta measure it when I get it all together. Wingspan. I think they were 118, so extra 300. Started out as a kit, and then it was custom built. It's really nicely put together. I was looking at the inside. It's in great shape, and yeah, you guys know they've been listening to for a while. That they didn't. Fortunately, the ailerons are big, and the elevators are relatively big, but they had a very small amount of bevel that they sanded in before they covered it, because they didn't need much for their IMAC, that they're flying with the plane, the precision aerobatics they were using it for. So, but yeah, fortunately, you can't do anything if the ailerons are too small or way too far from the root. I've experienced that stuff. But this should work good. So I beveled those, beveled the elevators, beveled the rudder. So now I'll have throw. So I've been talking to, for a year in these videos. I keep saying I'm going to get this thing done, and it's on the bench. It is on the bench. So yeah, I've worked on the surfaces. I've worked on the servos. Worked on, new tail wheel, new rudder servos in the tail because they had pull, which pull is totally dialed. Like pull's probably better than push-pull. But yeah, just to keep it simple. Like for me, I'm really getting sidetracked like usual. I used to I had some rudder servo arms made up for the bell cranks. I generally would do a bell crank. Sometimes I would put it on the end servo on a pull. This is all on the inside of the plane. But I had plates made up that compensated for all offsets and all widths. So if you crisscross the cables or ran the cables straight, or no matter what offset or width you had on the tail, it had the compensations all built in, because it was a series of holes. It's like 16 holes on each side, and like an inch and a quarter offset on each side. So you're pretty much covered no matter what you did. So I had a bunch of those plates made, so I was always dialed on these planes, and I don't have that done right now, so I can either have those made or just go push-pull. So I'm just going push-pull on this. I'm sure it's going to be fine. I'm not going to fly this for precision, so if it's a little tail heavy, that's great. And I could always add like a big aluminum spinner on the nose or something. That's a long story for just, it's going to be fine with that setup. So I got all that work done. So I just mounted the engine. It's got a big old space. That's another story. I mean, there's room here to put a DA200 or even a DLE222, but I like the DA200s. Not a lot of power, but man, smooth motor, and it would be way plenty power on 118-inch light plane like this custom kit. So it gets kind of interesting. It is heavier. I have the light version, but I really want the magnesium version because, this construction is 22 years old, and it doesn't have all that carbon fiber reinforcement like the Skywings and the Extreme Flights. So you hate thinking about putting an extra weight on the nose, but it is interesting. It's got the space for it. All right. Well, we'll say one more thing, and then we'll get on to the engine tuning. But yeah, so on this one, I'll be doing my standard throttle setup, which you can see on many of the planes I built last year in the videos from last year, where I extend this arm that comes on the carbs. It's got that big 5mm hole, and you can see the little, around a 4 440 3mm size. Even that sometimes it's a little small for that. You got to drill it out. Closer to like a 2.6mm size a lot of times. But this hole down here, yeah, that helps. It's a big old 5mm hole. You'd have to use a 5mm bolt through there, which I did last year, and I have a video of that too, but it's kind of bulky. So I'll deal with this. One of the ways I'm going to try on this, since I have a little time, I'm going to call DA tomorrow and see if they have those bushings. I don't know if Walbro's making those bushings or DA's making those bushings or what, but they have a bushing that you put in here. And it's got a hex head on the backside, but it's real thin. And then it fits perfectly in the 5mm, and it has a 3mm hole in the center. So you can run a 3mm bolt through, and that would be nice. But usually what I do, I talk about this all the time too, so I will drill a hole, you know, so where there's 2 holes. Like I said, I have a video from last year where I put a bolt through here. I kind of show every which way you can do this, but that's kind of bulky. So I'll drill a hole. Either I'll drill a hole just right there, you know, below that one, or even one above it, and just have 2. You know, I can do that. Or I can get that bushing from DA and use that hole, the small hole there, and then use the bushing. So I'll see what I end up doing. But what I tell you guys all the time is this is hardened steel, and you could take your regular drill bits and burn up like 20 brand new ones and not make a hole through this, not even get started on a hole. But you get some cheap cobalt bits, and they go through it like it's mush, like it's butter. So yeah, as long as you have those, 1 second, you'll drill it right through. And then that'll extend this, and I'll put that, instead of putting that on the inside, I'll put it on the outside, you know, the extension. And the extension, I'll use a heavy-duty, not one like this, but a heavy-duty high-tech plastic arm. And I'll put it on the outside. And what that does, by putting it on the outside towards the muffler, is it gives me, and then, you know, it extends down to here, and it gives me more space from the reed block. So then when I put my ball link in there with the panhead China nut on this side through the ball link, and then a red Loctite nut on this side, I'll have space here to where the ball link doesn't rub against the reed block, because it's actually not going off at this point, it's going off of this side, because this is where the extension is on that arm. And then it gets me down here where I have this big gap anyway, you know, so the gap down here gets me further away from the heat of the muffler. So I get further away from the heat of the muffler, and by putting the extension on this side and not this side, then I get more room for the ball to clear the reed block. And then from there, you know, I go straight back to the servo, which I just mounted with the spot-on RC adapter. And then, yeah, you're totally dialed. And you can see, let's see if I line this up. That's pretty lined up. That's about where that will be. That's why I set that. So that's about where the ball link will be after the conical is on there, and that lines up, you can see, just on that side of the arm right there. So it lines up right here, so pretty dialed. So I am finally working on this thing, and it is cool, and it always has been. I can't wait to fly it, but you know the deal. This is a big floaty plane, so it's not going to be an XA plane. It's a 3D plane. It was originally designed for IMAC, but this was considered like the greatest 3D plane of its era. You know, all the big boys, all of the elite boys at the TOC, you know, not all of them for sure, but it was popular amongst the elites at the TOC in that era. So I'm looking forward to flying it, but you know, the reason I haven't really jumped on it, because I am trying to get better at XA, and it's not going to be an XA plane. And here we are 10 minutes in, and Tony's still waiting about this motor. But yeah, XA, whew, like for the last couple months, you know, I made some progress on the rifle rolls. I got that feature video where I'm rifle rolling like 3 feet high, full throttle, you know, and then you just think, well, you're just going to be a badass after that. But, you know, instead I've assembled a lot of planes and went to an event and, you know, did other things, got some work done and things. And, you know, I feel like I'm not even that good now. Like, that was like a miracle. Like, I got to work super hard and then to get that to be second nature. And what I'm working on now, and everybody's known this. Alvin was telling me months ago, and um, Juan Sanchez, when I was up at Sacramento, he goes, "You got to work on descending, in the rifle rolls, to where you descend down and then level out and then climb back up." Because I start out level and I just want to climb right away because it's safer. So I'm not getting that skill of descending, which is what I need. So that's what I just started working on. And it's another pucker factor again. Now you start at like 30 feet, you want to descend to like 15 feet and then level out and then go back up to 30 feet. And I'd rather start at 5 feet and go up to 30 feet. So XA boy is brutal. I don't know. I said it a couple times, like candidly, in the last year. I said, well, first off, and it just mostly I'm just giving all this encouragement and tips and tricks and my experience, whatever's worked for me. But like occasionally I've been candid, just kind of like quickly said, you might not be able to do it. And oh no, man, if you're not a teenager, whew, I think about the 3D pilots like at our field, and they're pretty good and stuff. Like, I mean, I'm just projecting because of my own personal thing, but like it's a commitment, and it's discouraging. It's kind of a long, discouraging commitment. But yeah, I feel like more, the old saying that more failures happen just before success. And, I've been getting some planes together and getting everything dialed the way I want, and haven't been really working on it as hard as I want. I want to do some sim time, which I've never do, and I want to make another push, but I haven't been pushing the last 2 months. Once I got that rifle roll 3 feet high full throttle, I was like, pretty good. But my rifle roll skills are really not very good. And so, yeah, I'm going to try to make another push. But man, it's hard. But that's the reason this thing's been backburnered, is, I even dropped down from the 114-inch planes, to trying to get rid of all the big planes and get all little planes, little 120cc class planes, and just keep trying to rifle roll, and all the other maneuvers too, trying to get the pinwheels and cartwheels low and in control, and pop a cartwheel or pinwheel on the runway to a torque roll is the goal. Yeah, I can do that stuff like 60 feet up, but I want to do that 10 feet up. So yeah, and then the rail work, that funny word, switchbacks, the wing slaps. So gotta work on all this stuff. Oh, and then what's it called, the elephant walk. So I'm getting better at elephant walks, but I'm not doing them low yet. So that's all a lot of sidetrack. But yeah, still, that's the reason I haven't jumped on this plane, but I am really looking forward to flying this because this thing's going to fly great. So let's see what we can say, and then anybody wants to put comments into for Tony. But you know me, I can't just go right into it. I'm already 14 minutes without getting started. But first thing, because it is part of it, like these are very simple. It's just a chainsaw, weed whacker motor, 2-stroker. I'm going to post that video. There's a really good video that has animation of how these things work, and the little different flavors, different variations. It even goes into rotary, like ZDZ has, and then the carburation, reed blocks. How there's different ways and different setups for these 2-strokes. But naturally, we're carburetor, we're reed block. And the video shows real nicely how that works. But, most of us know the basics of how this stuff works. But, if I have a trouble motor, it's like in software, I always went, hardware, or not software, but a computer problem. I'd always go hardware, firmware, software. So I would check the hardware first. The hardware's got to work. You got to be plugged in. Things got to be on. But check all your hardware first. Make sure your hardware is right. Then check your firmware. All your EEPROMs, everything, and then go to the software. So check them in that order. Don't just start messing with the software when you actually had a firmware or hardware problem, because you'll never fix it. So the basics, these are very basic. They're the same in all of our engines. You just have your cylinder, and you have your piston going through, and then you got your bearing, your hub, output shaft. And the reason I bring those up, if I was having trouble, like Tony's having trouble, just like I thought I didn't have any trouble with this motor. This motor ran like a dream, but I was temping it hotter than I was used to, and that's just because I was flying different and landing different and shooting it different. My telemetry would have been the same on this of any motor I ever had. So it's one of the things, you think you know everything. I learn stuff every day, and that's one of the things I learned this year. And one of the most fun things I learned is from Don Hamp about, when you got fiberglass in your skin, to put some duct tape on it and pull it off and the fiberglass will come out. That's been like awesome. Thank you, Don. But there's been a bunch. I've learned a bunch of stuff the last year, even though I was already, an expert at this stuff. So anyway, if I was having trouble, just like with this one, I thought there must be trouble with this engine because of the temps I was getting, which like I said, I was wrong about, but I just took it apart. So that's super easy. Pop the muffler off, pop these 4 bolts, there's 2 on each side on this jug, pop the jug off, and then you can take a real good look at the cylinder, all 360 degrees of the cylinder, and all 360 degrees of the piston. And you can check out the ring and the blow-by and all that stuff. So if I was having trouble with the motor, I'd make sure that my hardware was good. So I would take a look there. And you can also, the quick check on that, even if you're at the field, before you even get to the garage level, before you get to the teardown level, if you grab your prop and it's nice and free and loose and you don't feel any drag or funny noises, that's a good indication that you don't have a bunch of carbon buildup, or you're not being, your rings are not scoring the cylinders, etc. But it's not foolproof. But if there's drag, then you really start to wonder. But when you take the muffler off, you can look, just from removing the muffler, you can look at the end of the piston to see if you see any scoring or like a bunch of buildup on the blow-by, and check out the rings to see their condition. It's only part of it, and you can also see part of the cylinder, but not too much of that either. But it can give you an idea. But just pop in these 4 bolts, you drop the jug, and you can see all of it. So it's good to know that that's there. And then, I think he said he bought the motor used. And then, the other thing is the front bearing okay? Has the engine been crashed or just had a bad prop strike, and is the crank twisted or bent? Most likely twisted in that case. But you can set up a mic, so run this over to some type of solid surface and put a mic to it and then spin it and see if the mic stays true. You can also mic the shaft, but if the shaft's a little bent, it doesn't do any, it doesn't hurt you. But it's, you can straighten it and everything. It's more important if the hub is true. So those are kind of your hardware considerations. Maybe continuing in the hardware considerations is that your reed block's not leaking. You want to check for any puddled fuel anywhere around the reed block or carb, which would be, if it's leaking, it's also leaking air. It's not going to run good. And then from there, pop the carb, pop the reed, and then check your pulse port. In that video that explains how these work, and most of us know, the crank's building up pressure, and that's sending a pulse through, and that pulse is the membrane gasket in the carb, which is called the pump, and that pumps the gas. So it sucks, creates negative air pressure, sucks gas from the tank, and that's how you get your gas up into the carb. Then it's mixed with the air, dumped down into the chamber, into the crankcase chamber, and then as the piston moves, and the port opens and closes, and that mixed air and gas gets pushed up into the opening in the crank, the area of the crank above the piston, and that also pushes out the exhaust from the fired gas from the last rotation, and then it's not really a rotation, the last movement of the crank. Well, the crank's rotating here, I guess, but the piston's going back and forth. And then, so the exhaust gets pushed out, and the new air and gas mixture gets pushed in, and then as the crank moves back down, that gets sealed off again. Then the ignition fires the spark plug, and that explodes, and the whole cycle keeps going. So if you got to check to make sure that it's a small 1/8 of an inch or less pulse hole that goes through, and you got to make sure your gaskets are not covering it, and that your reed block's in the right orientation, all these spacer plates are in the right orientation, the carb's in the right orientation, to where that pulse gets pushed through correctly to the right spot on the carb. So you can just, it's a good idea, you don't need a manual or anything, just look at it, and it's a good idea to you to figure it out, and see how it works. Sometimes the gaskets are shifted a little bit, so like half the hole is covered, and sometimes it's fully, the gasket's on backwards and it's fully covered. So if it's half covered, even, I like to, make a mark, take it off, and take an X-Acto and really carefully cut out like that 1/16 of an inch where it's partially covered, then put it back and make sure it's all clear. So that's another big thing too. When I change these bolts, these 4mm bolts that run through the carb and the reed block and get attached to the crankcase, I generally put Norlock, wedge washers on here to hold them, because I like those things to be firm and not to move. I put those on. I put the Nordlocks on all my props, and I put them on all my engine bolts. So I'm pretty big on using those. Oh, and I also put them. I get the small OD ones, and I put them on my mufflers. So that's all stuff you'd be looking for in computer terms. We call that the hardware part. So I better stop with that analogy because I don't know where the firmware and software parts are. But yeah, those are things that you could just physically check to make sure they're okay. Now, one of the things you'll run into, let's say all that stuff's dialed, you can run into is the carb. There's a lot of parts in the carb, and you could have blockages, you could have partial blockages, you could have a dirty filter. You also have, the gaskets, whether they're old and then they've gotten stiff, so it's the membranes that make up the pump. And then you've also got a little, volume control by way, I forget the terminology and all this stuff. I used to rebuild these Walbers all the time and have all the terminology. By way of a fork that goes in on a shaft that has a mount for it, like an area where it attaches, where it fits into. What do we call those guys? I know there's names for all this stuff. I used to say it all the time. But the way that those are bent, so you can look up videos on YouTube for rebuilding Walbro carburetors, and they go over all these details. So I didn't really want to get into it because the point is that you can really become a master. And the pop-off pressure, you can get your pop-off tools, you can get all your gauging tools, and you can really become a master of rebuilding these carbs. And sometimes they look clean, and everything looks clean, and all the needle areas and everything, and with this methane in the ethanol, sorry. Is that right? Ethanol? Methane? Not methane, ethanol. See, I forget it. I forget the names of everything. They really can shellac up. Whereas I noticed like 20 years ago we didn't have near as much of the... It has to be ethanol, right? Am I saying that right? Yeah, it's definitely not methane. That's from plumbing. So then... Yeah, it's got to be ethanol. So then... yeah, see, look, no ethanol. That's what's nice, but that stuff's expensive. So, 20 years ago we didn't have near as much, and I noticed my carbs never got gummed up when I was flying 20 years ago. And then when I was flying 10 years ago, I had to replace the carbs like every 150 flights. I just throw a new carb on because that stuff would shellac up in there, and you try to clean it out, and you think you cleaned it out as good as you can. You're using a compressor and everything, and any little brush tool that you have, and it just never cleaned out. It does seem to be less of a problem this time. I don't know if they keep changing formulas, but the point of all that, yeah, you can become an expert, and I used to do that more, take the carbs apart and check every little detail about them. But even 10 years ago is when I started. I just said, well, let's get some backup carbs. So I just started throwing a new carb on. Like, I don't have time like to spend the whole day for $50 on a carb, So, but all of that last like 3 or 4 minutes was to tell you that it's really good to have spare carbs, or at least one spare carb, for a lot of reasons. One is there are a lot of parts in here. It it's its own world to sit there and learn how to perfectly clean and perfectly test and gauge every part of one of these wellbore carbs. It's no big deal. Like, you can get the tools for less than $100, watch a couple of YouTube videos, and you can become an expert on them. But if you have a spare carb and you've checked all these other things, I'm so long-winded. And this isn't even this isn't even a really good engine tuning guide that I'm gonna make. But if you've checked everything else, and everything's in good condition as per we just talked about, and your pulse holes and your air leaks, everything's dialed, and you're still having trouble, it can be your reeds or your reed block, but most likely it's your carb. And either you could become an expert on the carbs, which is like, say, it's not that big a deal, or if you have a spare carb or two, which I always do, and then you just pop that on there and everything's dialed, then So at that point, you can get a carb rebuild kit, and you can watch those videos and get those tools and do it yourself, or you could just, be happy with a new carb that you paid a few bucks for and call it good. So that's kind of the hardware end for the most part on this. And then before we get into tuning, then another thing that can get you is atmospheric air pressure. So the way that air travels over the carburetor, and then also what I ran into for the first time ever last year was when I bought a plane that there was no air intake in the front of the carb at all, which I didn't think was a problem. I thought they were just like on there for scale looks, but the carb kept getting hot. So after a couple minutes, I would have trouble with the engine running. But it always ran good when I first got there that day. It started up fine, and the first 2 minutes were fine. After that, I had nothing but trouble. And then I finally just drilled a little 1-inch hole in the front of the cowl, and it blew over the carb and kept it cool, and all problem solved. So you can have atmospheric air trouble, and then you have to look into that. So those are some of the things. Now all of that, so if Tony's still listening 28 minutes in, then you got tuning. So, a motor like you said, you have a GP 123, so you can go with the standard stock settings for the carb, the wellbore carb that comes with them, off the GP website, and you're going to be right there. I would try, since the motor, well, you said it only has like 4 runs on it or something, so I would go the standard settings, which you think I would know since I have so many of those motors, but I don't. So just go to GP website and do the stock settings for the high and the low. And if it's only got 4 runs on it like that, or even if it's under 20 runs, under 30 runs even, go to stock settings and then take it out a quarter on the high and an eighth on the low from there as your starting point. And then go see, if it fires up. So, and I'm sure the normal procedure on these. You'll get to know your motor, after a while, to where you'll go to the field, like on the GP 123s. If you've just been flying the last couple of days, you go to the field and you'll just do one choke flip on it, ignition on or off, doesn't even matter. You might as well leave it off and just do one flip with the choke closed, and then you open the choke, and 1 to 2 flips later you'll start right up. They're really phenomenal motors. At first, most everybody knows, and it's the standard way, close the choke and flip it till it pops, which is always a little too much gas, or generally, not always, but generally a little too much gas. And then you open the choke, and then you flip until you start, which, and that method usually is a few more flips to clear the gas to where it does start. If you buy a plane, if you put a new engine on, or you buy a plane that's been sitting for a long time, then your first order of business will be to get gas before you start thinking about ignition and tuning. And one of the easy ways to do that is just grab the prop and just bang it on the compression, back and forth, bang it on the compression, pop, 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 and then you'll see gas start to leak out of the carb, and then you have gas. From there you don't even have to choke it. You do that with it choked anyway, so that is choking it, but you don't have to flip it with it choked with the ignition on or anything to wait for the pop. You can just open the choke, have the ignition on, low idle, and just start it up. Then from there, it sounds like you're already at this point that we're at 31 minutes in. And from there, like I said, look up the stock settings for the GP123. Go a quarter turn richer on the high and 1/8 inch richer on the low. Fire that baby up. It sounds like you already know how, or if not, the procedure I just explained. And then at that point, you probably have a tack. I have a tack on all my planes, so I just look at the side of the hatch of the plane. I just look straight down and I just see it. It's really convenient. But if not, if you have a tack or a friend has a tack, and you can sit there and tack them, see what the max you can get on the high is. On a 2810 on a GP123, you're going to get around 6,500 RPMs. So it's kind of nice. Like, I have the tack there, and I always know if I'm in the ballpark. If it's a new engine, or even if I've got 300 flights on it, I can always just look down, especially if it doesn't sound quite right. And if I'm getting like 5,800 Rs or something, then I know something's wrong. So you can tune the high at that point to where you're getting max RPM, and then from there they say back it off 100 RPMs. I don't even mind if you back it off 200 RPMs from there, especially that, because you said the motor's, I think if I'm remembering right, the motor has like 4 flights and it's new, so 200 or 300 RPMs off of max is great. And if you see a little smoke, that's great too. And you should be able to run the motor up. You don't want to run a new motor, they say, for more than 20 seconds on full throttle. So, but I'm even, I like to think even less. And it's the old rule of thumb is nice to run the motor up for 10 seconds at full throttle on the ground, and to make sure it's not sagging at all, not drying out, leaning on you at all. But I go for like 5 or 6 on a new motor, and I'm good. Maybe 4 or 6, 4 or 5. And yeah, sounds pretty good, then I'm good. And especially if it's stumbling just a little bit, and if I see a little smoke, and if you don't have the tack, ears are fine, and senses are fine. You can smell it too. You can smell it, you can hear it, you can feel it. A little extra vibration when you're rich, and it sounds like fuel running through it. It doesn't sound real clean, or real dry. You can tell when there's fuel running through there. It sounds rich and wet. So you want it, definitely if it's got 4 flights on it, you want it rich and wet on the high, for sure. Yeah, and get 20 flights on that thing. You get 20 flights on that thing, it's broken. Practically at 10, but at 20 flights, which you can do in like 2 days, you're dialed. Then on the low, you could tell even the way they start. Like, if you keep having to prime it, then it's too lean on the low. If you don't need to prime it at all, it might be too rich. But really, don't worry about that. The way to know if it's rich is it just won't idle. If you have to idle, again, attack's nice, but you can go by ear. But if you have to idle at 2,200 RPM just to get it to keep running, then you're too rich. So when they're new, it's nice if they can idle down to 1,400, 1,500, not 11, not where you're ultimately going to get it to idle once it's broke in with 20 or 30 flights, but it should be able to hold 1,400 RPMs. If not, then you're gonna keep leaning it a little at a time until it can at least hold 1,400. So you're playing. Let's say you don't have a tack, so you're playing. If you let go of it, it'll move forward, but pretty darn slow. At 1,400 RPM, it won't just take off. At 1,100 RPM, they'll generally just sit there. That's after they're broke in. You could go for that. But you don't want it to go, if you don't have a tack, you don't want it to be up there at like 1800 Rs, or else it won't run, to where when you let go of it, it just like takes off by itself and flies by itself. And then you're too rich. You want to lean it down, like I said, yeah, into that 1400 range where it just, just moves a little bit on its own. You got to tune it for that. So keep, leaning it until it'll stay running pretty reliably at 1400 RPM, at least for a minute. It doesn't have to run all day there, but a minute. And then, from there, throttle it up, give it a couple good whops, give it a little, from low to high, and it shouldn't dry out. If it dries out, you got to richen it up. But I already had you start rich and then tune for 1400 RPM, so you shouldn't be too lean, at that point. So when you thump on it, from low to high, it should just go right up. It should sound nice and wet and throaty. And yeah, and the vibration's a little more heavy when you're setting them up like this too. And you could, guys break them in leaner than that. Reliable idle more like 1200 RPM and not much stumbling at idle and pretty lean, and they're just kind of smooth, so they don't really stomp on the throttle when they're flying around while they're breaking in, because then it'll probably dry out and flame out, quit running. And lately I've kind of learned it's not the end of the world as long as you fly it smooth and you don't get it too hot. But I like a little bit richer, I always have, and then even all after my experiences all this year and stuff, I still like a little bit richer for the break-in. So then, yeah, you're gonna be, reliable idle around 1400. You're gonna see a little bit of smoke. It's gonna be stumbling just a little bit, but it doesn't just want to conk out because it's too rich, And then you should have your high idle. I like to run them 2000. Even 2200, for the first few flights. So I don't even have to think about it, and then you're just listening in the air, the whole time. And yeah, that's why these, like that flight I just posted, a third flight on the brand new Edge a few days ago. I'm not doing much, in the flying, because I'm not even hardly looking at the plane. I'm listening. So I'm listening all the time. I'm going inverted, I'm going knife edge, and I'm just listening. And I do a couple of small up lines, like even those a little bit of an angle, like 60 degrees, 45 degrees, and I'm just listening, all the time. To even if I'm trying to roll, for fun, I get bored, so I want to roll, and then I'll start rolling, but I'm listening. And you could tell, yeah, it should just honk, up on an up line, or when you punch it, it should just honk, but then not have the normal speed that a broken motor will have. It won't have the top end speed because you're a little bit rich, but it shouldn't slow down anywhere or hesitate, anywhere. Yeah, and that comes back to, you may have all this down, Tony, already, and you're like, you haven't helped at all. So if you're having some trouble right now and you have all that stuff down that I just mentioned, that's when it's nice to have the spare carb. Because, if this stuff's all decent, if your cylinders and pistons and your crank and hub bearing, if those are all decent, and your reed block, and you don't have leaks and all that kind of stuff I mentioned, then, it's very likely that it's the carb, is dirty or not performing one of its functions as well as it could. So it's really nice to have a spare carb. And then occasionally on a motor that's running good, running fairly, and both cylinders are firing and everything, rarely but occasionally, it's the ignition is not quite working right, or the pickup sensor is not quite working right. And we didn't mention that the pickup sensor could be off on its timing too, if it got moved. There's usually a scratch mark there so you can see where it's supposed to be. And you could always measure top dead center and all that stuff. It get a little sidetracked, but it is nice to have a spare carb. I could have started this whole thing by saying that, because that's what I was thinking in my head to tell you. But yeah, that's kind of where you're at. So I mean, a short way. You asked about tuning, so I explained everything just now. But a quick way a brief way, a concise way to say that might be to, you just start out both needles rich, and then, tune it to where you have good power on the high, but a little less than your maximum power, so that you're not drying it out. If you fly it and you feel any slowdown in an upline, then land it and enrich it. If you fly it and you smell any heat, feel any heat, and if you temp it when you land, and it feels hotter, then richen up the high. And then the low, start that out rich too, and then tune it in to where, not to the point where it'll idle down to 1100, but then when you thump it, it just dries out and stalls, on the ground when you're running it up, but more to where, it will idle at 1400, maybe not idle at 12 or 11, maybe just kind of stumble out right there, but it idles reliably at 1400. But when you thump it at 1400, it doesn't lean out and stall, and, dry out on you. So that's kind of it. And if it's just tuning, you can try some of those tune things I just mentioned. And if you have a carb that you could swap, that's a big thing. And it's nice to just buy one and have one handy. If it's not just tuning, and that's the other thing. Even if the point is, like I always say, if you're chasing needles, there's something wrong. So if you come down and you're like, well, that's too rich now, and it's stumbling all over and it has no power, and then you lean it and then it's too dry or it doesn't run right now, and you're just chasing needles, past like 2 or 3 little refinements, if you're just chasing needles and you're not getting like the results you expect from the needles turning, like you turn it out another quarter, nothing happens, another quarter, nothing happens, you're just chasing needles for, I'd say like if you're into your 4th time landing and messing with the needles, there's something wrong. You always say that. If you're chasing needles, it's not the needles. It could very well be, you just need to swap the carb, or something else is going on. So, yeah. In my little experience, I wish I took a video the other day. It would have been fun to have a video, but, yesterday I took and I mentioned it in the last video, I took the Skywing 104 Slick, the green and white one, to the field, all excited to get the maiden. It was pretty late. I don't know what time it was, 7:30 or something. And Chris was down there and he was super helpful. He's like, let me help you, let's get it up. And he's doing everything and getting everything ready and gas and handing me stuff. And then I flipped for about 3 minutes. That's a long time, and it's not starting. And I go, I told Chris, I'm trying to think of what I did. What did I not plug in? Because I don't think I have spark. And he goes, you want me to flip for a while? I go, yeah. So he flips for a while. He flipped longer than me, like maybe 7 minutes. So now we got 10 minutes in flipping. And he goes, no, I think you're right. It's got to be the ignition. And I go, yeah, it probably is. So we could have tried to get it running a lot longer. And I have done that in the past, on my dumb days. But it was pretty likely the ignition, because we took the cable off and we were getting voltage to the ignition, but we never got a pop. We never got any spark. And so we actually did good. So we could, after 10 minutes, put it away, drug out the edge, had some fun, and then came home, and in the safety and solitude, relaxed atmosphere of the garage, I was able to take my time and figure out, the ignition was DOA, and swap the ignition. So those are the kind of things that can happen to you when you build assemble a new plane, or when you buy a used plane. You're never sure exactly what you're getting. In other words, that makes it sound worse, but you're never sure if something needs tuned up. So 45 minutes. This is supposed to be a 5-minute thing, Tony. Just letting you know a couple little tricks. But I'm going to make an engine video. I'm going to break the whole thing down, take the engine apart, take the carb apart, have all the Wellbro tools, the pop-off meter, everything, and like go through the whole thing and show how it all works, show how to do it. But at the end of that video, I'm still going to say too that it's good to have a spare carburetor too, and a spare ignition or two. And all right, man. I know nobody's listening to this anymore. Everybody's asleep at this point. But yeah, I could leave Tony hanging until I make that more polished video. At least, hopefully, something in this video will help. All right, Tony, out.